All right, what's up? Good morning, everybody. Hope everyone's doing well on this Thursday morning. I again apologize for the ambiance. I'm down in my unfinished basement trying to let the family sleep here while I'm up early chatting with you all. So I want to pop on today and talk about change. I would say of all the things that we talk about at courses and we talk about in our different groups, this is one that gets me really excited because I think the possibilities, if you embrace a certain mindset, are really endless. And I guess that I would start by chatting about a couple people that I have a profound respect for and maybe giving a little bit of their history to sort of illuminate our conversation going forward. So for those of you who listened to Peter O'Sullivan's episode on the EIM Clinical Podcast or on Pain Reframed, actually Tim and I, it was 12 hours apart. So John and I interviewed Peter, and then 12 hours later, Tim and I interviewed Peter. So we've actually had him on both podcasts recently. But maybe go back to the EIM Clinical Podcast if you haven't heard it and take a listen to Peter's story, because it is one that just pulls the most profound respect out of me. That's for sure. Look back, it's an amazing story. Look back at 1997. When Peter published that article, the evaluation of specific stabilizing exercises in the treatment of chronic low back pain with a radiologic diagnosis of spondylolysis or spondylolisthesis. So it was a classic article, and I think every one of us who lectures on back pain has at some point referenced this article where they basically utilized specific spinal stabilization to treat back pain in individuals who have a diagnosis, a radiographic evidence of spondylolisthesis. And it was shown to have some good outcomes, right? And not only was that article shown to have good outcomes, but that whole idea really caught fire over the next few years. So many of you are going to be familiar with Hyde's article in 2001 showing the reduction of recurrence of back pain over a 1-year period, utilizing specific spinal stabilization. So my point is that here Peter sort of initiated this wave of thinking regarding specific spinal stabilization that A, got very popular and got a lot of acclaim, and B, had a very tempting model, right? So, I mean, it's a great theory. If you think about that someone might have excessive movement at a certain motion segment in their lumbar spine, and we've got these deep muscles, the transverse abdominis and lumbar multifidus, that literally wrap around and attach right to each of those segments, and certainly, if working better, per se, might be able to control that segment and prevent it from leaving the neutral zone and causing symptoms. So the model is believable and appealing. The theory caught a tremendous amount of attention. And you can imagine the possibility of really getting caught up in that and anchoring down and saying, this is what I believe going forward. It's been successful. It's brought me a ton of attention, right? And this is good. I'm going to stay here. But instead, you listen to his story, and you listen to as he treated patients over the next 20 years from that point, how his patients not doing well enough, to his patients failing, if you will, forced him to reevaluate his model. Right? So because he cared so much about his patients, and he was very honest about that in the podcast, that it was really just the fact that he wanted people to get better so bad, and utilizing that specific stabilization model, that bracing model, wasn't doing it. And he remained open to the fact that then maybe there's a better way to do it. And ultimately, flipping almost 180 degrees to adopt a model that is much more about fearless, thoughtless movement. Right? And one could almost say those are opposites, right? The first one being very specific, thoughtful bracing. The second paradigm being trying to relax all of those muscles and really allow for fearless, thoughtless, functional movement where you let your body move in natural patterns as opposed to control it. So my point here is that example is particularly shocking because it's such a 180. And it was driven by a desire for the people that he was caring about to have success. And it was allowed by Peter remaining open to changing what might have been deeply held beliefs on his part. Think about Tim Flynn's story, another individual who I have a tremendous level of respect for that only grows with every passing year. Think about the fact that he went to an so Michigan State background, right? Tim, I believe, went to, I can double check this with him, but I believe the number he told me was he went to the same course at Michigan State 16 times. 16 times. Went to the same course that was very much so steeped in the biomechanical model, right? So osteopathic background, biomechanical model, utilizing, a lot of static palpation, FRS, right? So sacral positioning, ilium positioning, and having those positional diagnoses drive treatment and intervention. Okay, so think about going to a class that you respected enough that you repeated it over and over and over again, trying to really deeply ingrain those principles in your head. And then bring on 2002, when Tim explored the clinical prediction model for who might respond to spinal manipulation, individuals with back pain who might have a favorable response to spinal manipulation. Now, my understanding in talking with Tim is that he fully expected that the things that would be predictive of a response to spinal manipulation would be a lot of the stuff that he had ingrained by repeating similar classes over and over again and really understanding the biomechanical model. For example, asymmetries in the pelvis, right? Or asymmetries in movement, like with Stork test, in looking at whether or not the ilium is upslip, downslip, positions of the sacrum. However, the data that came out of the trial suggested not so much. In fact, it suggested that actually only a couple things from the physical exam and more stuff looking at fear and acuity and pain location were really driving the bus on who might respond well to spinal manipulation. Imagine that moment. Imagine that moment being somebody who deeply held a certain belief. Enough it drove you to retake the same course more than a dozen times to make sure you had it down perfect. Think of the resources and the time that you invested to creating and solidifying that belief. And now you have emerging data that suggests that maybe that isn't the case. And how does Tim handle it? He opens his arms to it, right? Hey, maybe there's a better way. Maybe we're looking at this wrong, right? Maybe there's other predictive variables, right, that are more important than some of these physical exam findings that we've been gathering and valuing for so long. And he does an about face, right? And he ultimately winds up calling himself a recovering biomechanist, right? Somebody who has seen emerging data that suggests that maybe these biomechanical principles or biomechanical theories either don't hold up or aren't as valuable as other characteristics about the patient that might drive improvement. Again, a willingness to open yourself up to emerging data, to remain soft, to remain curious, right? And ultimately to stay in that mindset because you care too much about whether or not your patients get better to allow your deeply held beliefs to prohibit that advancement. I admire those two people to the nth degree for a million reasons, but one of those reasons is a willingness to remain open. And I wonder sometimes, are the rest of us staying in that place? Are we following our leaders' behavior and model by remaining open to change? And so I think about my own personal history, and I can point out some times where I was willing to shed long-held beliefs, right? So those of you who know me well know my story about Amy Pakula. Right, so Amy Pakula, a good friend of mine, someone I co-teach with. We brought Amy on when I was working in Bozeman. We hired Amy. I had been at the clinic for a while, and we brought Amy in. Now, guys, my background was very manual therapy based and very biomechanical based, right? And I don't want to say passive treatment oriented, but it kind of was. Right? That we would find the impairments, then ultimately we as the practitioner would fix the impairment and the patient would feel better. Right? So I came from a background that espoused those beliefs. And I thought that manual therapy was really the panacea. I thought the skilled laying of hands was really what fixed people. And I had put a lot of money into developing a certain skill set along those lines. And then we hire Amy, right? And I watch Amy practice. And one thing that was abundantly clear to me was that Amy was better than I was. There was no splitting that 3 or 4 ways. Overall, Amy's patients were doing better faster than mine were. And that was very clear to me. And it forced me to approach Amy and begin to understand that she was utilizing a clinical reasoning framework that I just did not have an understanding of, that was apparently extraordinarily useful to reduce pain and disability in our patients. And it made me want to know it so bad. And I'll be honest, guys, it made me shed a lot of the beliefs that I had up to that point, in which I had spent and held near and dear for years, not only during my graduate education, but in years following, and a lot of reinforcing Con Ed, not dissimilar to Tim's story. But the proof was in the pudding, right? Amy had both of those skills, but what differentiated her was the clinical reasoning framework. So I think about the willingness to shift patterns. That was many years ago, but there's been a lot more recently, right? So I think about just things that I personally have changed in the past couple of years, trying to give some examples as we further the discussion, is I think the model of prevention and health promotion is better than the model of sick care. I watch what Mike Eisenhardt is doing, and I watch what the guys at Proactivity are doing, and it's abundantly clear to me that that model is better. Right? That model is simply better. It's more cost effective. It does more good. Early intervention is key to long-term success. It's just a better model. I've been practicing the other model for a long time, but this model appears to me on all accounts to simply be better. Right? I think about the value of CrossFit. Folks, I'm not a weightlifter. I don't look like a weightlifter. I promise you, when I go to the gym at 9 today, I will not perform as an expert weightlifter. But to me, it's the value and the benefit of constantly varied high-intensity functional training is undeniable, right? I look at the adherence of people who do it, right? And the fact that they have community surrounding it and how much they value it. I think about the underlying science behind the sermon of mechanotransduction and how stressing the cell creates so many adaptive changes. I look at the evidence. The role of progressive resistance training and injury reduction seems to be very significant. And so all of that evidence has demanded that I change, that I adopt this, that I at least investigate this. And again, coming from someone who does not have a background in weightlifting, coming from someone who goes to CrossFit gyms, I got t-shirts from CrossFit gyms in every major city across the country, because every time I travel, I try to jump into one, right? That's not a comfortable environment for me. I'm always the worst guy. I mean, every time. I am routinely the worst performer in the gym, and I've learned so much. And I'm so thankful that I've been willing to drop my guard and say, okay, that's not comfortable for me, but the evidence is there. The science is there. The social proof is there. It is required of me, for the people that I serve, to entertain this. It is required of me, for the people that I serve, to find out more about this. And so I guess what I'm challenging you all today on is, are you holding yourself accountable for an openness to change? And how are you reassessing that? So I really want everyone that's listening to this today to just take a 5 or 10 minutes and make a short list. And do you have a couple of things, maybe 2 things, in the past 5 years where you have conceded previously strongly held beliefs in light of emerging evidence? And that evidence might be research, that evidence might be social proof, that evidence might be findings in your patients that are emerging over time. Have you changed, and has it been somewhat painful, 2 deeply held beliefs that you historically have defended? Have you changed 2 beliefs in the past 5 years in light of emerging evidence? I would argue that none of us are right often enough that there shouldn't be a couple things that you were pretty hell-bent on, that you have been forced to change or been open to change, right, in the past couple of years in light of emerging evidence. And to go one step further, would your colleagues vouch that they've seen that pivot? Because if you've really changed, right, you should have colleagues that say, yeah, Jeff, I mean, you used to really believe this, and we know that because you wouldn't shut up about it, right? But we got to, you definitely over the past couple of years have jumped tracks, and you now seem to be over here. So it's not just about you saying to yourself, yeah, I've really changed the way I think about that. My question to you would be, do your colleagues agree with you? So do you have people that can vouch for the fact that you made a pivot on a deeply held belief because it was more important to you that people got better than that you maintained your correctness? That's my question. And to go a little further, just to give a little more homework here, while you're making that list or hoping that you can make that list, how are you remaining open to that happening? So especially if you're someone who has a blank piece of paper you're looking down on and thinking, you know what, I really have not made any fundamental transitions or changes in my beliefs, I would question next, how are you creating the fertile ground for that change? So how are you making sure that you're remaining open to change? Because that really is the key to making change, is having yourself in a mental and sometimes physical environment that creates the possibility for change. So here's some things I might recommend, right? So just ask yourself this. Who are you following that you don't agree with? And I don't mean following that you're aware of them. I mean following in that when they publish blogs or they publish research or they go on a Facebook Live, how many people that you generally don't find yourself agreeing with at first exposure, how many of those people are you continuing to seek out and ingest their content to allow it to be brought in alongside your current beliefs for comparative analysis? And I don't mean reading their stuff with the intent to argue with them. I don't mean reading their stuff and then trying to figure out why they're wrong. I mean reading their stuff and evaluating it in a non-judgmental way. Who are those people? Can you write 2 of those names down? People that you consistently follow in a non-judgmental fashion so that you can bring in their information and compare it alongside your existing information. Are you remaining curious? That's a huge one. That's where I would say, if I look back at Tim and Peter's stories, that was the difference. They were curious. They were curious of whether or not there was a better way. When Peter's patients came back and they weren't doing well with abdominal bracing, he wondered why. He remained open to wondering why. He didn't say the patient wasn't compliant. He didn't say that they were malingering. He said, I wonder why I'm not getting the job done. He remained open and curious. And I think when you remain open and curious, that is I'll just say it. When you remain open and curious about why you're failing, that's when great things can happen, right? But to do that requires a willingness to kind of be raw and exposed. It also requires a certain level of confidence, right? Because you have to be open to the fact that we don't fail or succeed in broad brushstrokes, right? We fail and succeed in small areas. And so you've got to have a confidence that you're doing a whole lot of good. A lot of things you're doing are right. And that gives you that willingness to be open to the fact there might be certain areas you're not doing well. Think about Peter's story, right? Was Peter failing with his patients? No. And listen to he said right on the podcast, he was thanking his patients for a willingness to come back, even though they weren't doing better, because that's really what gave him that ability to evaluate the data and ultimately change. But think about what he's saying there. His patients were coming back to him to receive further care, even though they weren't doing well with the current care. What does that say about Peter's soft skills? It says a lot. It says a lot that his people, even though they weren't doing great, were still seeking out his care and trusting in him. He was not failing in broad brushstrokes. He was doing a ton right in the fact that he was creating that level of therapeutic alliance and that kind of a relationship that fostered an environment where his patients wanted to keep coming back even though their symptoms weren't doing a lot better early on, right? So again, it's that willingness to remain open because you're acknowledging all the things you're doing right while you're also willing to hold up what you're not to the light and possibly make some changes to it. So it's that willingness that I think just creates a significant ground for paradigm shift. Finally, are you remaining non-defensive, right? So are you excited about challenges to your current paradigm, right? Really think about that. Are you excited when something challenges your current existing beliefs? Are you excited? I would argue that we should be, right? Because it is in that challenge to our beliefs that holds the opportunity for things to get better, for us to be even more effective. It's that it is being wrong is so exciting because when you're wrong, we all know that we're doing an okay job, but when you're wrong, it means there's a way to do it better and you can start that now, right? So that to me, if you can have an excited perspective on being wrong, you are going to progress at light speed in your clinical practice. Because when you say, you know what, I don't think I'm right about this, and my patients on the whole are doing reasonably well, this means that maybe I can go from good to great, right? Maybe if I'm wrong about this and I can change that, and I'm already doing these things well, now maybe I can do well on top of well. It's a willingness to change firmly held beliefs above all else that creates fertile ground for greatness. And I think that if we can all be confident enough in ourselves that we're trying hard, if we can be confident enough in ourselves that we're doing the best we can, that we allow ourselves to be open and exposed to alter some of our firmly held beliefs that are near and dear to our heart that we have invested significant resources in. And we can do that because we realize that if we are wrong in certain areas, changing those areas can create profound change for our patients. And if we can allow our care for the people that we serve be more important than our ego about what we have learned historically, we can be next level practitioners. We can change society. But I am asking you today to gut check that. I would love for you to write down a couple things that you have changed. And remember, there should be some pain associated, right? So it should be like, oh, I really felt strongly about that. And I had sort of put myself out there to the public in believing that, but the evidence mounted and it demanded of me to make the change. And I did. And will my colleagues vouch for that? And more importantly, going forward, are you doing some of those things that create an environment and create that fertile ground for change? Are you following people non-judgmentally that you don't agree with? Right? Are you really reading and listening to what they have to say without getting defensive or angry? Right? Are you doing that? Are you remaining curious? Is the person you serve, their improvement, more important than your ego? I'll leave you with that today. Thank you all for being here. I am off to Connecticut, heading to Waterford, Connecticut. So I'm heading out there tomorrow morning. I'm looking forward to it. I've never taught in Connecticut, so that'll be great. I'm going to stop in NYC first and then drive over. So I'm looking forward to that. A lot of great stuff coming up. Fitness Athlete Live is going down this month in North Carolina. Check that out. John's Clinic. Thanks, Allie. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Check that out. Thrust manipulation in Boston. Thrust manipulation in Vegas, bike fitting in Michigan. There's all sorts of stuff going on. If you did not get the ICE email, make sure you check that out. It's got all of our updates for November. Guys, have a killer Thursday. Challenge your beliefs. Remain open. Be vulnerable. Make some change. Cheers, guys.